The 1994 season makes up a significant portion of the Storytime series, because if you can think of it, it happened during 1994. Cheating allegations, controversies, fatal accidents, and, well, everything. And the craziest thing is, I still have more to do on that year. There's still a few things that haven't been ticked off. I still need to do Adelaide, the scene of that coming together between Damon and the Michael, which I maintain becomes less obvious the more I watch it. There's also David Coulthard coming in and having a more detailed look at how he adapted to Formula 1 in the wake of Senna's accident, and then there's the return of Nigel Mansell that spilled over into 1995 and totally failed. And there's probably some other less obvious ones where I'll go, ooh, that's an interesting one for the future, because that's usually what happens. I'll talk about something and go, actually, there's one there I could potentially look at because that's quite interesting. But I guess that's what's so mental about the 1994 season. Not even Hollywood could have written it. So what have we got today then? Well, today I've got something that I've been meaning to look at for a while but simply never got round to doing it. It's simply a case of Formula 1 looking at things and going, how could it possibly get any worse than this? And the reason I say that is because of what happened just 2 weeks before the events of this Grand Prix weekend. The race weekend before Monaco 1994 was the one name that some fans hate hearing. Imola. The race where Formula 1 lost 2 drivers in the space of 2 days, and the thing is, it could have been 3 in 3 days. One driver was lucky, the other 2, not so. But the whole thing about Imola 1994 is that it's been documented so much, it's probably not worth my time going into all the details, and the circumstances surrounding one of the crashes will be debated until the end of time. Bottomed out, steering column snapping, murder, the list continues. But Imola 1994 had only been the precipice of stuff that had been building up over the course of the year. I've mentioned these bits a few times, so if you've heard me mention these before, I can only apologise. But rule number 1 of these things is, assume everybody is new and that nobody here has watched you before. But anyway, even before the season had really got going, drivers were ending up in hospitals. JJ Leto was injured before the season even began, hurting his neck in a testing accident, which led Benetton to replace him with Jos Verstappen for the opening 2 rounds. Funnily enough, Leto had got that seat after beating Michele Alboreto and Luca Badoer to it. Never knew that. And then, during the first round of the season, Eddie Irvine, Verstappen, Eric Bernard and Martin Brundle were involved in an accident, where Brundle was lucky to not be seriously injured. Coming down the straight between turns 3 and 4, Irvine moved out to try and overtake Bernard's Ligier and might not have seen Verstappen there, although it could have easily been a block. Either way, Verstappen ended up on the grass and then spun back across the track, swiping the Jordan and the Ligier off the road, and then mounted the McLaren, with the left rear wheel of the Benetton striking Brundle's head. And then in testing between Brazil and Aida, Alesi then injured his back while testing at Mugello. Although nothing happened at Aida in terms of drivers getting injured, Imola then happened. So things moved on towards Monaco and the mood around Formula 1 was sombre. A driver had not been killed at a race weekend since 1982, and the last time 2 drivers had been killed in one weekend was in 1960 when Chris Bristow and Alan Stacey were killed at Spa, minutes apart from each other. Unlike Imola 1994, it could have been 3 drivers killed in one weekend because Sterling Moss was seriously hurt when he crashed his car in practice. But changes were already in place going into Monaco. The FIA had mandated a 50 mile an hour or 80 km an hour speed limit in the pits, and speed limits had been trialled in practice sessions the previous year. And there had been discussions between the FIA and the teams to allot pit stop laps via a lottery, instead of the teams deciding based off how the race was going. But because this was Monaco and the only place to overtake at Monaco is in the pit stops, which the FIA knew, they had the idea to do it this way, just simply on safety grounds. But the teams went with simply nominating which lap the driver would pit instead. It seems like going a bit too far, but with everything that had happened already that year with 4 drivers injured and 2 killed, they had to do something before it got worse. At the same time, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, the Union of F1 Drivers, reformed, with Niki Lauda, Christian Fittipaldi, Michael Schumacher and Gerhard Berger at the head of the organisation. Max Mosley was initially against the reformation of the group, but was happy to be consulted by any driver regarding safety issues, such as in 1996, when the GPDA wanted to put in some sort of measure to prevent accidents similar to that of Martin Brundle's crash at Melbourne. It was also the GPDA's push in the immediate aftermath of Imola that saw the speed limits in the pit lane become a permanent fixture of Formula 1, as well as the temporary chicane seen at Spa and Barcelona, leading to more permanent changes being done to other circuits. But it seemed that things weren't going to be turning a corner just yet, because at the Monaco Grand Prix, it seemed that things were just getting worse. Karl Wendlinger was driving for the Sauber team in 1994 as he had done in 1993. Wendlinger had been part of Peter Sauber's Mercedes operation in the World Sports Car Championship, before Peter and Mercedes left that world behind for Formula 1. Wendlinger had been the 1989 German Formula 3 champion, which had got him a drive at Sauber in the World Sports Car Championship in 1990, where he'd go on to finish 5th along with Schumacher, Frentzen, Mauro Baldi and Jean-Louis Schlesser, and his performances through 1991 saw him and Schumacher get placed into Formula 1 late in the season, thanks to Mercedes. Schumacher would end up at Jordan and then Benetton, the story of which I've covered, and Wendlinger ended up at Leighton House. Much like Schumacher at Jordan, Wendlinger brought Mercedes money to the cash-strapped team, but while he qualified 22nd out of 26 cars at Suzuka, he was involved in a Turn 1 pile-up and didn't finish a single lap. While at Adelaide, it was held in torrential conditions, and he ended up finishing 2 laps down on race winner Senna before the race was abandoned. Basically, he'd spent the whole race aquaplaning off the road in the horrific weather, while driving a car that wasn't anywhere near good enough. But there was one extra problem with that Leighton House. Karl Wendlinger is 6 foot 2 inches tall, which made him at the time one of the tallest Formula 1 drivers on the grid, and one of the tallest F1 drivers ever. Dan Gurney was 6 foot 5 and Justin Wilson was 6 foot 4. Alex Wurz is 6 foot 2, Alex Albon is 6 foot 2, and Esteban Ocon is 6 foot 2. There's not many drivers taller than that. There might have been a couple from the 50s that might have been around Wilson or Gurney's height, but I'm not going to check the heights of every single F1 driver since 1950, so no need to get typing that I forgot someone. Either way, Wendlinger was tall. Wendlinger stayed on at Leighton House, now the March team, for 1992, and they managed to make a change to the car, and it was pretty much the only change they could make to the car to make it so he can actually fit inside the thing, and he ended up repaying them with a points finish at the Canadian Grand Prix. So for 1993, Wendlinger joined back up with Peter Sauber. His partner for that year was JJ Leto and was initially slower than the Finn, but started to turn it around after the first few races. He could have been on for a good result at Donington but was wiped out by Andretti, and he was also wiped out by his own teammate at Monaco. But overall, he scored 7 points with some good finishes, and Mercedes, who were on their way back into Formula 1 with Sauber, decided to keep him on for 1994, while bringing in fellow Sauber Mercedes sports car driver Heinz-Harald Frentzen. And Wendlinger's season had already got off to a decent start. He scored a single point with 6th place at Interlagos the opening round of the season, although it could have been 4th if not for an engine issue that dropped him back into that 6th place finishing position. He didn't score anything at Aida, but then at Imola he scored a 4th place finish, albeit in tragic circumstances. After that came Monaco, and he was already on for matching his 1993 points tally, but in practice, his career changed forever. The chicane at Monaco, much like a lot of the rest of the Monaco street circuit, has remained unchanged, at least at a first glance level. There have been reprofiles made to Saint-Devote and the swimming pool complex, with barriers moved back or removed entirely, the pit lane going through the inside of Saint-Devote and then not going through the inside and then going through the inside again, and the most recent changes have been to the exit of the swimming pool section to make it slightly faster. But the chicane down the waterfront after the famous tunnel was pretty much as it is today, only that the curbs in 1994 were like the ones you'd find outside your house that separate the pavement from the road. At the time, these were curbs, and in the wake of Barrichello's accident at Imola, the FIA was in the process of standardising the heights to prevent a repeat accident. But those curbs hadn't been lowered by this point. The real changes would be made in time for 1995 and then refined through 1996 and 1997. But the chicane back then, as it is now, can be quite dicey on the way in. It's bumpy and off-camber, because it's a public road, so designed differently to a regular racetrack. Public roads are usually humped in the middle to allow drainage, and if a Formula 1 car, especially one from the early 90s that ran super low to the ground, bottomed out or hit a bump at the wrong angle, it could make that car lose control. And that's what happened to Wendlinger. After doing a lot of searching, it seems that nothing broke on the Sauber, with all reports I've seen just simply saying that he lost control. The car ended up going broadside into the retaining wall at the chicane that separates these two, I guess we can call them roads. Is that what they are? Is that bit that goes towards the back actually a public road? But either way, it sort of splits the road in two. Part of it goes towards the back, and the other part is the escape road and the old Formula E circuit. The Formula E circuit that was also the layout used in Sega Rally 2. And it's also an accident very similar to the one that Button had and Perez had at the same place. Karl had actually braked 13 metres later than he normally would have done, and the Sauber just lost it on the bumps of the road. In an interview with Motorsport magazine, Karl said that the Sauber in general was twitchy on bumps, especially at Monaco. There is some very grainy footage of the accident on YouTube, and Wendlinger comes flying in at a rate of knots, and he's actually quite lucky that he misses the curb on the inside of the left-hand part of the chicane and the curb on the right-hand part of the chicane, because if he had, he'd have had the exact same accident that Barrichello would have done, and he could have potentially hit the marshals behind the retaining wall that splits those two roads off. Unlike today where there's Tech Pro barriers and other safety devices there, what was there in 1994 was a bunch of plastic containers that were supposed to be filled with water. I say supposed to be because they weren't at the time, and he bounced off them into the escape road. And actually, he almost misses them. Had he missed them, he might have been alright. But while the accident doesn't look particularly, destructive, it was actually life-changing for Karl. His vitals were fine when the doctors got to him. He'd hit the wall at only 110 miles an hour, which doesn't sound like much today with everything on the cars, but this was the days before the HANS device, which if you've never worn one is super limiting, and it's uncomfortable, but you're glad to have one if you're not used to racing car braking performance. This was also the era before the FIA mandated the high cockpit sides that were made compulsory for 1996. So with all that going on, Karl had actually hit his head on the Armco, and it's a miracle he didn't break his neck. After the accident, Karl was taken to the Princess Grace Hospital in Monte Carlo, but was then taken by helicopter to Nice, where he was in a coma for 3 weeks. For 19 days after he woke up, he didn't know where he was. His girlfriend, now wife, said that even though his eyes were open, he looked like he was dead, and doctors didn't think he'd recover. He had told one doctor after waking up, "I am Karl, I am 25 years old, and I am from Kufstein." But 2 days later he told them, "I am Karl, I am 12 years old," which caused the doctors to anticipate the worst. Gerhard Berger, who had helped Karl in his junior career, lent the family his plane so he could travel to Innsbruck afterwards to properly recover, and after 10 days in Innsbruck, he started to connect properly to the outside world. He finally realised he was in a hospital, but with no recollection of how he got there. Doctors then told his girlfriend that if he could live without 24/7 care 12 months from this point, it would be a miracle. It is quite similar to Richard Hammond's jet dragster crash in a way. Like Hammond, Karl had a very bad short-term memory once he'd woken up. He'd read only the sports pages of the newspapers and then read them over and over and over again, because he'd simply forgotten that he'd read them. He also wasn't eating much, either because he'd forgotten he'd eaten or because he didn't want to, and lost around 19 kilos or 42 pounds in weight. But on the 30th of July 1994, he was finally cleared to leave the hospital and go home. In August, he was driving a Porsche Cup car, and that was a step in the right direction. But as Karl admitted in an interview with Motorsport magazine, a Porsche Cup car and a Formula 1 car are two different things. In the September of 1994, so 4 months after the accident, Peter Sauber set up a test session at Barcelona to see where Karl was in terms of his recovery. But Karl was in a lot of pain and didn't think that he'd be able to drive again for the rest of the season, which led Peter Sauber to say, "Well, I don't think I can offer you a contract for 1995. The thing is, when the doctors released Karl from the hospital, they were hoping he would go home and just lead a normal life. Getting back into a Formula 1 car is not normal. But it was clear that the accident had left Karl not the driver he once was. Brain injuries tend to do that, and again, going back to Hammond, he's now starting to feel the after effects of it. There was another test at Barcelona in the December of 1994 that Wendlinger went to, and he was suffering from blurred vision and headaches, with him only able to do 2 flying laps at a time. But despite that, he got close to Frenson's times and won the 1995 contract. By the time February rolled around, he was back to some semblance of normal. Whatever normal is when you've had something like that happen to you. But the concentration had gone. At the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola in 1995, Karl was driving around thinking of things like his dog that he had as a kid and his apartment at Monaco, which, when you've got other people driving at high speed around you, is quite dangerous. So Sauber took Karl out of the car, allowed him to recover properly, and put Jean-Christophe Bouillon in. At the final round in Australia, Karl was back in the car, although he did the round at Japan as well, but at Adelaide he crashed the car and was suffering from all kinds of pain that had come back as the result of that crash. So faced with fines from Bernie if he didn't start the Grand Prix, they basically said, "Go out, but just pull over and make it look like a mechanical." But that was it. career over. F1 career, that is, because in 1999 Wendlinger was the champion in the FIA GT series and then won the LMGTS class at Le Mans 2 years running, as well as doing well in the 1996 Super Tourenwagen series in Germany. His full-time career ended around 2010, so he still managed to do plenty of racing after the accident. For Formula 1 though, Wendlinger's crash helped accelerate things. No pun intended. In the aftermath of the crash, Sauber became the first team to add raised cockpit sides to the car to help protect the drivers' heads in a side impact situation, or an incident similar to that of Brundle at Interlagos in 1994, with those raised cockpit sides being introduced at the next race in Spain. At the same time, Max Mosley started coming down hard on the safety aspect of things and told the teams they had to make sweeping changes to the cars for the very next Grand Prix. Smaller airboxes, raised ride heights, smaller front wings, and other changes to try and slow the cars down and make them safer. Although these changes were likely instigated because of the events of Imola rather than the events of Monaco. Although in 1996 the raised cockpit sides were made mandatory, with the FIA looking at developing a head restraint system in-house to try and reduce the risk of injuries suffered by Ratzenberger, Wendlinger and later Mika Hakkinen, who would have a similar accident to Wendlinger at Adelaide at the end of 1995. The development would go on for several years until the FIA followed NASCAR with the adoption of the HANS device. But for Formula 1 though, in a season marred by so much tragedy and controversy all round, Wendlinger's crash was something he absolutely did not need at the very next race after 2 drivers were killed. A race where the other Sauber was withdrawn and Simtek and Williams ran with just 1 car out of respect for Ratzenberger and Senna. The 2 grid slots at the front were left vacant and the drivers gathering for a 1-minute silence before the race. A moment so poignant that even Niki Lauda removed his hat. But the thing is, this isn't the full story of the 1994 Monaco Grand Prix, because a lot happened beyond this one thing, and it actually ended up being one driver's best ever drive. At least a lot of pundits think so, and he thinks so as well. But like I say, that's one to look at in the future. So then, a look at the horrendous shunt that Karl Wendlinger suffered during practice for the 1994 Monaco Grand Prix. If this has given you some insight into something you might have heard about but don't necessarily know a lot about, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And for more like this, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the fine bunch of lads at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level. And if you want to help keep the lights on around here, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you want to buy me a New Year's Eve tipple, and memberships for those who want to Patreon, but without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Millward, and I'll see you in the new year for another video. So until then, goodbye.